미디어 심리학 8주 3차 시간을 시작하겠습니다. 챕터 8은 정서와 동기입니다. 이번 시간에는 교재에 있는 내용에 추가해서 어떻게 이모션을 측정할 수 있는지에 대한 관련 동영상을 보도록 하시겠습니다. 본 강의에는 어드밴스한 내용들이 포함되어 있기 때문에 디테일한 내용보다는 과학적 연구가 어떻게 이루어지는지에 대한 큰 흐름을 파악하는 데 초점을 맞춰 주시기 바랍니다.
So today, what we're going to do is focus on the ways in which we actually measure the emotions once they're set off, once they're triggered. This is really using a multi-componential approach to emotion that's going to guide our roadmap today. So first, we'll try to look at ways in which people measure the subjective experience of emotion, or how do I feel? Then we'll look at the ways people measure the outward expressive display of emotional behavior. In other words, how do I look when I feel emotional? And finally, we'll conclude by discussing physiological ways of responding. So physiological tools to measure emotion in the autonomic and central nervous system, answering the question of what is my body saying when I'm feeling a given emotion. We'll conclude with our takeaway questions and expert interview. So let's start with the question of how do I feel? How do we measure the subjective experience of emotion?
우리는 feel, 느끼는 것을 측정할 수도 있고 look, 보이는 것을 측정할 수도 있고 body, 신체의 생리적 변화를 측정할 수도 있습니다.
So, as we discussed earlier, emotions have these multiple components. So emotion needs to separately assess each of these three components. Here we're beginning with subjective emotion response, which is contrasted with behavioral and physiological response domains.
측정 분야는 다음 세 가지입니다. subjective, 주관적, behavioral, 행동적, physiological, 생리적 측정입니다.
When we think about subjective measures, we can roughly break them into three broad categories: self-report questionnaires, continuous rating dials, and experience sampling methods to capture emotion in everyday life.
주관적 측정에는 퀘스처네어와 레이팅 다이얼과 매일매일 정서를 샘플링하는 익스피리언스 샘플링이 있습니다.
So let's begin first with some common questionnaires. So one of the most common questionnaires to assess both positive and negative emotion experience is called the Positive and Negative Affect Schedule, or the PANAS, P-A-N-A-S. So as what you can see here, there's a host of different emotion-related adjectives which participants are asked to rate on a scale of very slightly, a little, moderately, quite a bit, or extremely. And so they can answer this in terms of what they're feeling right now, what they felt in general in the past week, or at a trait level, how they generally feel. And this is probably the gold standard for measuring subjective emotion experience.
파나스는 여러 형사들을 제시하고 자신이 느끼는 감정을 5단계 중에서 하나로 평정하도록 한 것입니다.
A new tool that's been developed that we use often in my lab is called the Modified Differential Emotion Scale, or MDES. And what I particularly like about this scale that you might be able to notice as you're sort of scanning through the different items here is that it has a much more rich repertoire of positive emotional terms. So we see feelings of awe, wonder, amazement, glad, happy, joyful, interested, alert, curious. So it comes in triplets, and people are asked to indicate to what extent they feel from not at all to extremely hopeful, optimistic / encouraged, as compared to, for example, love / closeness / trust. And this is really nice if you're particularly interested in measuring discrete or distinct types of positive emotional experiences using questionnaire measures.
또 다른 검사 기법으로 Modified Differential Emotion Scale이 있습니다. 이 검사 기법은 이전보다 더 포지티브한 단어들을 사용합니다.
Another commonly used questionnaire measure is called the Stress Appraisal Measure, or SAM. And what's nice about this is it gets sort of over potential or across potential language demands that may be inherent when people are using either the PANAS or MDES in terms of how they interpret emotional words and what their emotional vocabulary is prior to the experiment where they're filling out these measures. Instead, what the SAM uses is a graphical icon of a human man good old Sam. And what it's measuring really is emotional activation or arousal. So if you scan left to right, you see someone at the left who's not very emotionally activated, very low arousal, all the way up to the right where it's extremely emotionally activated. He's about to explode right here from so much emotional intensity. So this is a nice alternative if you want to see to what extent, if you take language away and just use graphical depictions of emotion-related intensity, if you're able to get the same kind of, response that you would get using emotion-related adjectives.
쌤은 스트레스 어프레이저를 메저라고 하는데 단어 대신에 그림을 사용해서 측정합니다. 오른쪽을 선택할수록 스트레스를 많이 받고 있는 것으로 평정합니다.
Let's think about questionnaires. So there's different ways that you can collect questionnaire responses. One way is to use traditional paper and pencil methods. So bringing the questionnaires printed out into the laboratory and have the participants fill it out, much like the picture you see here. So this is considered the traditional way that's actually now becoming more of the old school way. So it seems more and more that people are now collecting self-report questionnaires using computerized online survey methods. So one commonly used survey method that people will use is Qualtrics. So Qualtrics is an example of how you can actually program these questionnaires using this interface and have people, instead of writing out their response, simply click or select a particular response option on the computer and then have this particular online survey program output the data for you in either a very easily accessible Excel, SPSS, or other type of format.
설문에 대해서 답을 얻는 것이 과거에는 종이와 연필이었다면 지금은 온라인 방식으로 바뀌어가고 있습니다.
In addition, we see another method that's gaining increasing attention, which is Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So this is a very widespread and ever-growing way to collect data outside of simply college undergraduate samples from people around the world. So you can distribute surveys and even within the course of 24 hours have a large number of self-report questionnaire responses. So if you're interested more about this, you can definitely look at some readings that have suggested the potential power of a tool like this for collecting self-report questionnaire assessments of emotion in a relatively short time period.
아마존 메카니컬 터크는 개별 주문용 작업을 수행하기 위해서 원격으로 위치한 군중 근무자를 고용하는 크라우드 소싱 방식을 사용합니다.
Another method is called narrative methods. So this goes beyond general categories to capture more nuanced themes of a person's unique emotional life. So I particularly like this quote. This was a quote from the book Living Narrative, and it goes as follows. Putting events in a temporal sequence not only orders them with respect to each other, it creates an overarching interpretive frame. Just as a succession of notes does not necessarily constitute a melodic phrase, so events that are randomly recounted do not make a story. Like notes, the narrated events need to be cast as members of an ordered set. Like a melodic phrase, such a set constitutes a coherent narrative unit called an episode. So here what you're doing is you're collecting people's either verbal or written descriptions of their emotional experiences, and you can code it, along a rich dimension of different categories. You can look at the temporal sequencing of the event, sort of what's the linear trajectory or lack thereof in which they tell the story. You can look at the particular kinds of emotion words or metaphors people use. You can also look at the rich context that they embed their emotions in, and whether they describe their emotions as being something that they're an active agent over or simply a passive recipient of. So these are things that you simply can't get using questionnaires and that you can get using a narrative methodology. Related to this, Pennebaker has developed a computerized system called the LIWC, L-I-W-C, Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. And what he does using this system is he's able to take text of people's either verbal narratives of speeches that have been transcribed, or again, people will do writing assignments like the one in this slide, where they'll be asked to sort of keep an emotional diary over a time period where they record their deepest emotions and thoughts about some emotional upheaval. In his instructions, he asks people to really let go and explore the event and how it has affected you. You might tie this experience to your childhood, your relationship with your parents, people you have loved or love now, or even your career. And to write every day continuously for 20 minutes. What he's done with this exercise is taken people's written descriptions of the emotional upheaval or difficulty that they're currently confronting, put it through his computerized text analysis system, the Luke, and then looked at the prevalence of things such as pronoun usage, using more, for example, I versus we words, or looking at the kinds of emotional words people use, or looking at the kind of insight that develops in their sort of cognitive use of language as they write about this event every day for 4 consecutive days. So he's able to actually see change in people's emotional well-being as a function of the language or ways in which they describe their emotional experiences.
내러티브한 방법은 자신의 가장 깊은 정서와 생각에 대해서 글을 쓰도록 하는 것입니다.
Now we move from questionnaires and narrative methods to what are called rating dials. So you can see this here on the screen. What rating dials do that's really unique is they allow you to look at fine-grained, second-by-second measurements of emotion. So here what you have people do is while they're in a laboratory, you have them place their hand on a dial. So it may be one like the dial on the left, where they can move it from left to right, from very negative all the way over to very positive, or it can be more a straight line here, where very negative may be at the bottom and very positive at the top. And this has been used in studies while people are either watching dynamic films over a several-minute period or interacting in discussions with partners. And what people can do is literally shift the dial second by second as their emotion experience changes. So all the methods we've talked about so far are really looking at broader time scopes, asking people to rate in that moment how they felt on average or how they felt during emotional film after the film has ended. And what you miss out on are the fine-grained second by second changes, or what people call the affective chronometry of an emotion response. Here you can look at not only how intense someone felt an emotion, but what were the patterns of variability? How long did it take them to reach their peak emotion state? How long did it take them to recover? You can answer a whole host of really rich questions when you use continuous dials like this. The one disadvantage some people might argue is that it may interfere with the actual experience of the emotion. So you can imagine being in a conversation with someone while they're sharing a distressing event, and you may find it cognitively difficult to both pay attention to the individual speaking and sort of keep your hand on this lever, constantly moving it around as your emotion state shifts. But these are some of the rich possibilities that you can really extract when you use these, more continuous rating dials.
다이얼 방식은 매 순간마다 포지티브와 네거티브 사이를 조절할 수 있도록 한 것입니다. 예를 들어서 영화를 볼 때 자신이 느끼는 정서에 따라서 조절을 해가면서 볼 수도 있습니다.
And then finally, the third sort of common measure of subjective experience, as you can see here, is what's called experience sampling methods, often referred to as ESM. So ESM is a really fascinating way to collect information about a person's emotion state outside of the lab, in their own naturalistic daily life. So here, this is a type of data collection in which participants respond to repeated assessments at moments over the course of time while functioning and living within their natural life settings. So people originally would do ESM studies starting with the alarm clocks, stacks of paper, Palm Pilot pagers, and today with all the advances of technology, there's now iPhone apps that people can use to report over multiple times in a given day at random intervals, how are they feeling, what context are they in, what kinds of strategies are they using to effectively manage their emotions. So what's nice is that people can respond directly to these devices. It's time saving, it's convenient often for participants to do it at their own time in their own life. And what you can then do is just transfer this data relatively easily to a computer for subsequent data analysis. So this is one of the ways to sort of get outside of the lab and try to capture people's emotions as it's actually lived in their daily life for the subjective experience of emotion.
경험 샘플링 방식은 참여자가 일상생활을 하면서 샘플링을 통해서 참여자의 데이터를 컬렉션하는 것입니다.
So, for example, some of the things that experience sampling methods provide are the following, in addition to some of the advantages I just highlighted. So, experience sampling methods, one, allow you to understand behavioral contingencies. So, you can look at the relationship between the subjective experience of emotion and the actual events occurring in their lives and try to find some important causal link between what happens in your life and how that causes you to feel, or at least understand the association between the two. Second, it has good ecological validity. So this is a term we've heard a lot in this, three-part module on emotional elicitation and measurement, which really means how much does it map onto the person's own real-world experience? Because here, you're getting people to get outside of the lab in their own naturalistic, everyday environment. Third, what you can do here, since you're getting multiple measures of emotion within a single participant across, a wide period of time, maybe a couple days all the way up to a week or a month, is you can investigate what's referred to as intra-individual processes. So this is within-person processes, such as differences within a person that can change over time or across a situation. So we can all think of ways in which our own mood may fluctuate over the course of a day or in response to different kinds of events, and ESM lets you actually look at that scientifically.
경험 샘플링 방식은 세 가지 의미가 있습니다. 첫 번째는 경험과 상황 간의 관계를 파악합니다. 두 번째는 랩을 벗어나서 자연적 환경에서 실험을 합니다. 세 번째는 사람의 내적 프로세스를 여러 상황과 시간에 걸쳐서 측정합니다.
So we've talked a little bit about subjective measures or how we feel. Now let's move to behavioral measures, or how do we look? How do we behave when we're feeling emotional? So behavioral measures, some of the two most commonly used tools in this domain are the facial action coding system and the SPAF system. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. So we'll begin with the FACS system. So this is one of the first systems that was developed to systematically quantify emotion expressions in the face. So it was developed by Paul Ekman and Friesen in the 1970s. And what it did is tried to categorize facial behaviors, not based on overall sort of subjective impressions of how emotional the person's face looked, but instead based on a more sort of micro-level rigorous coding of the underlying muscle configurations that are used to give rise to an emotion expression. So every little sort of unit of muscle action, he would say, is what he called an action unit, or AU. And specific action units, or specific AUs, he would argue, combine together to reflect emotions. So we'll go through an example of what kind of AUs, for example, give rise to the expression of happiness when we smile. Now, FACS is incredibly rigorous and often considered a gold standard in coding emotional behavior in the face, but it comes with a cost. So it takes 80 to 100 hours to train on this system. And once you've gone through the training manual, you have to pass a nationwide standardized certified test to become what's called an official FACS coder. So this is something that myself and my students in my lab have done, and it's a considerable time investment. But once you do it, it changes the way you look at the face forever. You notice subtle muscle shifts all around in the face that we often, maybe barely detect or go unnoticed. And this particular system allows you to capture them, notice them, and quantify them. So let's look at an example here. So here you see an expression of a woman looking, for example, you might say she looks scared. Now, what are the particular muscle units in her face that make her look that way? So here, these codes here, 1C, 2C, 5D, etc., these are the action units. So the action units are the particular numbers here, 1, 2, 5, 4, 20, etc. And the letters next to them refer to the intensity of the display. So they go from A, which is sort of at the lowest end, so it's a trace, all the way up to E, which is the maximal intensity of how much you could contract that muscle. So you see a C here, that's somewhere in the middle. So she's raising her inner eyebrow at a moderate degree, right? And it really tries to code all of these separately, not looking so much at overall how do we think she's feeling, but what specific muscles are being activated and contracted while that particular expression is occurring. Now here, what's interesting is that you can use FACS to reliably identify what's called a real smile, or a Duchenne smile. So what are the characteristics of someone when they're smiling authentically? Well, there's two distinguishing features. One of them is called the AU6, or the cheek raiser. Now this, in older adults, older than this young girl here, we also call it the crow's feet. So when we raise our cheeks up, what often happens in us older adults is you see fine lines develop on the corner of the eyes. And so that's one kind of telltale sign that it's a genuine smile. And you also see what's called an AU12, which is really taking the corners of the lips and pulling them upwards, what we often think of as a smile. So this is a genuine smile. How do we contrast this then with a fake or non-Duchenne smile? So what do you notice here? What is different from the picture you just saw? So those of you who said, hey, the AU6 is missing are exactly right. So these kind of fake smiles we do for photos or in awkward social situations, what we're doing is we're trying to pull the lip corners up, but we're not able to move our cheeks up. We're not able to kind of get those crow's feet, in action. And that's because Paul Ekman and others would argue that a genuine smile is not something that we can voluntarily produce. It's actually something that's quite involuntary and usually only co-occurs when we're genuinely feeling happy. So if you want to know how to detect a real smile from a fake smile, look for the AU6, the cheek raiser.
Facial Action Coding 시스템은 사람 얼굴의 해부학적 구조를 통해서 그 사람의 정서를 읽어냅니다.
That you see not in this man, but you see in this young girl here. Okay, so now let's look at the SPAF system. So the SPAF system is really fantastic and includes additional codes that aren't inherent in the FACS system. And as you can see here, some of the additional codes that are included in the SPAF system and that were really developed to help measure emotional behavior in the context of dyadic interactions, frequently between romantic partners or spouses, are additional behavioral and even auditory cues. So it will have postural codes, such as when someone sits up or forward when they're talking to their spouse. It'll try to get at intonation, so whether or not there were changes in a person's vocal pitch or whether they were speaking at a different volume. And also gets at what are really important emotional behaviors, such as laughter, which the FACS system does not itself code, as it's only coding the ways in which the face is contracting in terms of the underlying musculature. So SPAF is also fantastic to use, and as you can see, it's based off the FACS system. You see the same AU6 and AU12, but it has additional codes here. So you can see the man on the right, this is Jim Cohn, a wonderful affective scientist in the field. And you see here not only the AU6 and 12, but also additional descriptions of things that are associated with interest, affection, validation, humor, and enthusiasm. And we might also look at whether or not he's showing an increase in his vocal pitch, looking at his posture as he's sitting up and forward, etc.
스패프에서는 몸의 자세, 목소리, 웃음까지도 정서 분석에 사용합니다.
So now we've talked about subjective and behavioral. What about our body? How does our body say anything about the way we feel emotionally? And how do we measure that? So I'll start here with our bodily sensations, looking at the question of, can things like our heart rate or heartbeat actually really be a window into our feelings? So William James, really the father of psychology, first echoed this notion that indeed the body is a window into the emotional soul. He said, no shade of emotion should be without some sort of bodily reverberation or some way in which our body shifts or sort of undulates when we feel an emotion response. And we'll talk about this more in the course. We'll actually have a specific lecture devoted to this where we look at this question of, is a heart really a window into our feelings? And we'll also look at the specific kinds of tools that people measure emotion in the lab, as you can see here. This is actually one of my research assistants, Christina Ruiz, and she has a variety of electrodes or sensors that are attached. And what these sensors do is they pick up electrical activity of the heart every time the heart beats, as well as looking at different respiration patterns. So what you can see here in this graph are things like the heartbeat, so the red signal here, and every little blue dot at the top is a distinct point at which her heart beats.
Autonomous Nervous System은 심장이나 호흡 등 생리적 변화를 측정합니다. 그래프에서 빨간 선은 심장 박동을 보여주고 있고 녹색 점은 피크치를 보여주고 있습니다.
And what you can do, and we'll talk again about this in more depth when we get to the psychophysiology of emotion, is you can map specific types of autonomic nervous system or ANS changes to emotion responses. So we can try to map specific physiological profiles of anger, fear, sadness, disgust, and even happiness simply based on changes in our bodily responses. So that's the peripheral or autonomic nervous system.
우리의 감정 상태가 anger, fear, sad, disgust, happiness에서 어떤 생리적 변화가 일어나는지를 표로 작성한 것입니다.
What about the central nervous system or the brain? So there's, three kind of major divisions of the brain that are thought to be included in emotion. So this includes the limbic system. So this includes the hypothalamus, amygdala, nucleus accumbens, and several other nearby areas, and has great importance in emotional life and memories for emotional events, as you can see here. Second is the striatal system, or the striatum. So this includes the putamen, caudate nucleus, nucleus accumbens, and it's divided into both the dorsal and ventral striatum, as you can see roughly here. And this is often thought of as the reward center of the brain. So it's often associated with the experience of pleasure or reward. And third is the neocortex. So this is the outer layer of the brain, as you can roughly see here, deeply folded and grooved. And here the prefrontal cortex is in the front part of the brain. And we think of this as sort of the prefrontal cognitive control region. So this is thought to be involved in the regulation or control of emotion. Each of these three subdivisions of the brain will also go much further into depth when we get to the brain basis of emotion. But what I want you to see today is there's really rich, complex tools to study bodily changes both in our autonomic nervous system and higher up in our brain that indeed provide clues into our emotional well-being. The central nervous system, we can look at responses using things called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. Here we can look at areas of the brain that seem to be activated during different kinds of emotional challenges or stressors.
뇌를 포함한 Central Nervous System은 fMRI 같은 방식으로 측정을 합니다. 어떤 정서 상태에서 뇌의 어떤 부분이 활성화되는지를 검사합니다.